This video is going to cover blood vessels and regulation of arterial blood pressure. The learning objectives that we'll cover include the types of blood vessels, regulation of blood pressure, and also regulation of tissue blood flow or tissue perfusion. So let's start with the structure and function of the major types of blood vessels in the body. If we look at our circulation and we start at the heart pumps into arteries. So arteries are blood vessels that deliver blood away from the heart, and they progressively branch into smaller and smaller arteries till we reach these microscopic arteries called arterioles. Arterioles funnel into tiny little capillaries, and then capillaries funnel into microscopic venules, and finally the blood vessels converge on larger and larger veins which deliver the blood back to the heart. We're going to use a model, a simplified schematic or model of the circulatory system in order to simplify things, and it looks like this. So in this model we have the heart. The heart pumps the blood into the arteries. Remember, the arteries are these elastic, basically delivery vessels. So they're high pressure, they're very elastic, and they basically are there to deliver the blood around the body up to your head, your legs, and all throughout your body. When people talk about blood pressure, they give you two numbers because the heart pumps blood, the pressure goes up briefly in those arteries, and then the heart relaxes and the pressure goes back down. After our arteries, we have those microscopic arterioles. I've only drawn a few here, but imagine that you have millions. And those little arterioles control blood flow to your tissues. Basically, by vasodilation or vasoconstriction, we change the diameter of the arterioles, which then changes the blood flow downstream. So arterioles control blood flow to your organs. Blood flows from the arterioles to capillaries. Capillaries have the highest surface area in the circulation, so we get lots of exchange and diffusion in our capillaries, things like oxygen and CO2, water, ions, glucose. Even hormones move in and out of our circulation within the capillaries. After the capillaries, we have microscopic venules which collect the blood from the capillaries and funnel the blood into progressively larger and larger veins. Some of the veins in our body have one-way valves to help promote the flow of blood back to the heart. So veins' job is really to deliver that blood flow back to your heart. So often we'll talk about venous return when we talk about the veins. Notice that the veins are drawn very large on this diagram versus the arteries because the veins hold about 60 to 70% of our blood volume. The other thing to notice is that the veins are relatively low pressure and the arteries are relatively high pressure, and so this pressure gradient helps drive blood flow through the circulation. Again, the highest pressure in the arteries driving blood flow back to the heart through the veins. The next slide actually shows a summary of the functions of the blood vessels, so you might want to pause it here. You might wonder, well, what are blood vessels made of? So blood vessels are simply tubes made of connective tissue and cells. So let's start and look at the structure of arteries. Remember, arteries are these high pressure, very elastic conducting blood vessels that help deliver the blood around the body. So we have connective tissue with lots of collagen for strength. We also have lots of elastin in our arteries. The elastin fibers and elastin protein allow it to be stretchy and elastic, kind of rubbery. We have lots of smooth muscle cells in the wall of our arteries and arterioles and even our veins. This allows the blood vessels to change their diameter and their shape. So a reduction in diameter is vasoconstriction. If we increase diameter, that's a vasodilation. There's other connective tissue supporting our simple squamous epithelial lining of our arteries, and really all of our blood vessels are lined by endothelial cells. Remember, it's just one cell layer thick lining those blood vessels. The amount of smooth muscle cells varies between arteries and veins depending on their size. The smallest arteries, again they're microscopic, are called arterioles. Arterioles control the blood flow downstream to our organs via the capillary beds. So remember, your organ blood flow is determined by the diameter of your arterioles. So arterial diameter is really important in determining resistance to blood flow. And so if we think about it, if you have a smaller diameter blood vessel, or arteriole, there'll be more resistance. If there's more resistance, there'll be reduced blood flow. If you make that arteriole bigger, there'll be less resistance and more blood flow. Again, we can adjust the resistance by just changing the smooth muscle in there and changing the diameter. The blood flows then into our capillaries. The capillaries have a very high surface area. They're a little bit leaky to water. We have diffusion of ions and glucose and gases in and out of our blood vessels. We even have osmosis of water back into our blood vessels. So capillaries, if you consider that they're so tiny that the erythrocytes actually move single file through a capillary. And if you look at a capillary, it's really just a small amount of connective tissue supporting that simple squamous endothelial lining. So those endothelial cells, remember, help prevent blood clotting. And we'll see in this video that erythrocytes actually move through your capillaries in single file fairly slowly, so the velocity of flow is fairly low in our capillaries. And here you can actually see real capillaries on a microscope. I believe this might be frog capillaries. But you can see the little erythrocytes, those little discs, moving in single file, going from a capillary probably into a venule. And these are moving a little slower than normal, but you can see their shape and how they line up one by one. Again, this will help diffusion and exchange of things into and out. Here you can see the flow is a little faster here of the red blood cells, but you can see them moving single file, again suspended in plasma, within these capillaries, and then they're probably flowing into a venule up towards the top. We can also see probably leukocytes and things like that moving in there, but since most of our cells are erythrocytes, most of these cells moving around are erythrocytes inside your little capillaries, and we sometimes call this the microcirculation, since you have to see these blood vessels on a microscope. And you can see the larger blood vessel, actually the larger blood vessels have higher velocity blood flow, whereas the capillaries, the velocity slows down a little bit. Again, helping exchange of things like oxygen going out to your cells or your muscle cells or your skin cells. Another thing to keep in mind about our capillaries is that they're leaky to water. So water is actually able to get through that endothelial cell layer. And so if too much water comes out of our capillaries, we can get swelling. And a lot of that water loss is just due to the hydrostatic or water pressure in those blood vessels. Luckily, though, we have lots of albumin. Remember, that's a plasma protein, which actually attracts water back into the capillaries through osmosis. So hopefully you don't leak too much water out of your capillaries. Next we have the venules, and one of the things the venules are most famous for is this where leukocytes can actually move out of the circulation into our tissues to fight things like infections. So if you had a bacterial infection, your leukocytes would migrate out of the venules and into your tissues. Then we funnel into our veins. Again, the veins are returning blood back to the heart. We have one-way valves in our veins, especially the veins in our limbs. So because the veins are so low pressure, gravity tends to pull on that blood, and so the one-way valves in your arms and legs helps bring that blood flow back towards your heart against gravity. Varicose veins are when some of those valves stop working and the blood tends to pool in your veins, and the veins will bulge up. So again, the veins are all about venous return. One thing that helps venous return is contracting your skeletal muscle. So when you walk around or exercise, the skeletal muscle pushes on the veins and helps in venous return by squishing the veins. If you compare the typical artery and vein, you can see that the arteries tend to have a thicker wall and the veins tend to have a thinner wall. So arteries have more smooth muscle and veins have less. However, veins usually have a larger diameter because they store more of your blood volume. If we compare the connective tissue, you expect to see more elastic fibers and elastin protein in your arteries. Also note that the blood within your arteries, your systemic arteries, is bright red because of the higher oxygen, and then darker red in your veins because of the low oxygen. The blood is actually not blue in your veins. All right, next we're going to explain and talk about the regulation of arterial blood pressure in our body. So we want to keep our arterial blood pressure very stable. If it's ever too low, we can get dizzy and pass out. If it's ever too high, we can get damage. So this is classic homeostasis, where we try to keep a relatively steady blood pressure all day long. So regulation of blood pressure is going to be an important idea in physiology. So one of the things we notice is that when we talk about blood pressure, we talk about a high pressure and a low pressure. Well, when your heart's relaxed, the pressure in your arteries is low, so say 60 millimeters of mercury. When your heart contracts and pushes a bunch of blood into those elastic arteries, the pressure shoots up, say 110 millimeters of mercury. So we have this sort of fluctuation of our blood pressure each time the heart beats and then relaxes. And so we call the high pressure systolic pressure and the low pressure diastolic pressure. We're going to often talk about mean arterial pressure, or MAP, which is a mathematical sort of combination or average of the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. You don't have to memorize the actual equation. We'll just kind of say it's right about the middle between those pressures. Again, why is arterial blood pressure so important? What's the driving force pushing the blood around your circulation? And it's really the delivery blood pressure, because it's the blood pressure in those large arteries delivering the blood throughout your body. And there's an actual pressure gradient in the blood going all the way around from the arteries to the capillaries, veins, and back to the heart. So when we talk about blood pressure, I want you to always remember we're talking about arterial blood pressure in these large arteries that deliver blood to things like our head and our arms and our legs. And so when we measure it in our arm, we're measuring arterial blood pressure. It fluctuates again due to the pumping action of the heart, and then we get this pressure drop as we move from the arteries to the arterioles and on to the veins. Again, when we talk about mean arterial pressure, we're just taking an average of that systolic diastolic blood pressure. The blood pressure drops off a lot in those arterioles because there's so much resistance, since they're the tiniest little arteries. So mean arterial pressure, what determines it? What will determine your mean arterial pressure? This is an idea that we're going to cover a lot here in this video. Well, one thing it depends on is the cardiac output. And another thing it depends on is total peripheral resistance. So we're going to talk more about these so you understand this idea. Cardiac output you've already learned. TPR really has to do with the arterioles and how much vasoconstriction or vasodilation those little arterioles have. So cardiac output, I hope you remember, is dependent on the heart rate times stroke volume. And heart rate really is just how many times does a heart beat per minute. If you increase heart rate, you're going to increase cardiac output. Pumping more blood into those arteries increases mean arterial pressure, which increases the driving force of blood flow in your body. And we can do that by activating our sympathetic nervous system. Another way we can increase cardiac output is simply increasing the force of contraction of those little myocytes in our heart. That will increase the stroke volume with each beat, which will increase cardiac output, pump more blood into those arteries, and increase your mean arterial pressure. Again, we can do that with things like norepinephrine released from our sympathetic neurons. Other ways we can affect our stroke volume, you might remember, is to adjust the venous return back to our heart. So one way we can actually increase stroke volume is simply to give the heart more blood to pump. So we increase venous return leads to an increased stroke volume. If we have more stroke volume, we'll be pumping more blood, and it'll increase our mean arterial pressure. So one way we can do that is actually by activating our sympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine causes constriction or vasoconstriction of all those little tiny veins and even some of the larger veins, which helps push the blood back towards the heart, which would increase our blood pressure. Another way we can increase venous return is to add blood volume to the body, either through a transfusion or just make more blood. Again, it increases the amount of blood the heart pumps, which increases our cardiac output and our mean arterial pressure. You can even just give somebody extra saline, which will increase your blood volume as well. So again, these are ways we can increase our blood pressure. Now let's look at this total peripheral resistance. It simply refers to the resistance of all the millions of arterioles in your body. So remember, the arterioles determine the resistance in our circulation. So if we have vasodilation, that will open up all those little arterioles, decrease our total peripheral resistance. The blood flows out of our arteries, so we decrease blood pressure. The opposite would be if we have vasoconstriction. We shrink all those little arterioles, less blood moves into our capillaries, so it stays back in your arteries. That would increase arterial blood pressure. Again, why? Because you're increasing the total peripheral resistance, and by this mathematical equation, you increase your blood pressure. So let's look at some real-life examples and see if this makes sense. So we're basically thinking about cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. In this first example, let's say you're stressed out because your exam, and you have activation of your sympathetic nervous system. You release lots of norepinephrine on your heart, which increases heart rate. It also increases contractility, which increases your stroke volume. Obviously, you're going to be pumping more blood. That's going to increase your mean arterial pressure. You might also be increasing norepinephrine release in the tissues in the skin and the guts, which is going to increase your TPR, basically constrict all those little arterioles. That's going to increase your blood pressure as well because it's trapping the blood in your arteries. Maybe even you activate the vasoconstriction of your veins too. So that's what happens when you have stress. You increase your blood pressure. Let's look at an example of people who have a severe allergic reaction. Basically what happens is you activate your immune cells, and your immune cells release lots and lots of chemicals. Some of those chemicals cause vasodilation of your veins. And then the blood stays and pools in your veins, which decreases venous return to your heart. So your heart doesn't have as much blood to pump, and that decreases your blood pressure because you're decreasing cardiac output. Some of those same chemicals also cause your arterioles all over your body to vasodilate, which causes a severe reduction in your total peripheral resistance. Again, this causes your blood pressure to go down even more. So these two things, when you have this allergic reaction, can cause a dangerous drop in your blood pressure, and that's what can actually kill you from a severe peanut or bee sting allergy. A doctor might want to give you an injection of epinephrine in order to save you in that situation. So let's consider what happens when you get injections of epinephrine. Well, epinephrine acts a lot like norepinephrine, and it causes widespread vasoconstriction. So this increases your TPR, also increases your venous return, which helps bring your mean arterial pressure up. So in that allergic reaction, that might help save you by increasing your mean arterial pressure, which allows then mean arterial pressure allows blood flow to essential organs like your brain and your heart. Let's consider exercise. Exercise is a pretty complex response. One of the first things we have during exercise is an opening up of all those little arterioles to our heart and our skeletal muscles and even our skin to cool us off. So that vasodilation decreases our TPR. A decrease in TPR would normally decrease our mean arterial pressure. But at the same time, when you exercise, your sympathetic nervous system stimulates your heart rate. It also stimulates stroke volume, so your cardiac output goes up a lot when you exercise. You also vasoconstrict your non-essential organs like kidneys and guts, and you also constrict your veins. And so this is going to help increase venous return and sort of adjust our TPR in our non-essential organs. So actually, when you exercise, your blood pressure may not go down at all. It may actually go up or maybe not even change. So again, because your TPR went way down, but your cardiac output went way up when you exercise, there's not a large change in your blood pressure when you exercise. All right, so hopefully blood pressure is making sense to you if you can just keep in mind what happens to the heart, the veins, and the arterioles. Let's look at two real-life examples where your body has to regulate blood pressure. One is where you have bleeding or blood loss, and the other is dehydration. So maybe you had sweating and you didn't have a lot of water around, which could easily happen in Mesa. And again, this all relates to homeostasis of keeping blood pressure constant and keeping blood flow and blood delivery to your organs. Okay, so let's say you had trauma, car accident, and you had a lot of blood loss, or maybe you got bit by a shark. And so when you have blood loss, it might not surprise you that your blood pressure gets severely reduced because you just don't have as much blood for the heart to pump. So our body's going to need to adjust to bring that blood pressure back up towards normal so that you can survive. So how are we going to do that? Well, first, we're going to have to think about how the body responds. And we're going to activate our sympathetic nervous system. So you remember that the medulla oblongata is sort of in charge of our blood pressure. And so it's going to activate our sympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine will stimulate our heart rate, stimulate our contractility, constrict our veins, constrict our arterioles. And all of these things, if you look and remember our equation, MAP equals cardiac output times TPR, all of these things are going to cause our blood pressure to go back up towards normal. And again, the idea is just to get enough blood pressure so we can keep our brain and our heart alive till we can make more blood or get access to water, something like that. So again, our blood pressure may not go back up to normal, but it might just get high enough so that we can survive. And I don't expect you to memorize all this, but if you want to pause it, these are just the factors that affect cardiac output. Things like your blood volume, your veins, whether they're constricted or dilated, contractility of the heart rate. And then TPR is pretty easy to remember because it really just has to do with the arterioles. So one of the things you might wonder is, how does the brain even know what my blood pressure is? I mean, again, the blood pressure is out in my arteries. How does the brain know? Well, the medulla oblongata has a group of neurons, and their job is to monitor your blood pressure. And they are going to need to get blood pressure information from your body. And the place that we give our brain our blood pressure information is mainly from our carotid arteries in our neck, and also from the aorta, which comes directly off the heart. So these blood vessels have afferent sensory neurons that are wired up to those arteries, and they sense stretch. And then they sense the stretch, which is your blood pressure, and they send afferent signals to the medulla so that the medulla can make a decision about our blood pressure. So here's just a more anatomical representation of where in the carotids do we actually monitor and sense the blood pressure. And the way this works is you have these little dendrites that are in the connective tissue of, say, the carotid artery, and they actually sense stretch. And the little dendrites can tell whether, if there's high pressure, there's more stretch. If there's more stretch, they send more action potentials back to the medulla. If there's less stretch, then they send less action potentials. So let's see this at work. If you were in Mesa and you started sweating a lot and were dehydrated. So this is called the Baroreceptor Reflex. It's basically blood pressure regulation. So if you sweat a lot and you don't have a lot of water to drink, it can actually affect your blood volume. So again, it's really hot, you're sweating a lot, you forgot your water, and so we lose extracellular fluid volume, which mixes with our blood and our plasma. So you basically reduce your blood volume, your heart can't pump as much, and your blood pressure goes down. And again, our blood pressure goes down to a level that's noticed by our brain. We might start to feel dizzy. So again, remember, we're sensing our blood pressure in those carotid arteries. Those little neurons are going to sense that because there's going to be less stretch. Those sensory neurons sense less stretch. They stop sending or send less signals back to the medulla oblongata. So less action potentials is interpreted by the medulla oblongata as meaning low blood pressure. And this is called the Barrow Reflex or Baroreceptor Reflex. When the medulla senses low blood pressure, it sends out efferent signals to various effectors like our blood vessels, specifically the arterioles. It also sends information action potentials and releases norepinephrine at the heart. It also activates our veins. So all of these effectors will respond and hopefully bring our blood pressure back up. The heart will speed up and contract harder. We will vasoconstrict our arterioles, which helps bring our TPR up. We'll also constrict those veins, which will help our venous return. All of these things will help bring our blood pressure back up, either through TPR or through cardiac output. And hopefully it'll get our MAP, our mean arterial blood pressure, back up to normal. One thing to keep in mind is what happens when you exercise in extreme heat and you're dehydrated. Now you've got to try to send skin blood flow to cool you off. But what if you don't have enough blood flow or blood pressure to maintain blood flow to your muscles, your brain, your heart? You're going to have to stop sending blood flow to your skin, and that can make it hard to cool off. So that's just something to think about. And that baroreceptor reflex was on that last slide if you want to pause it. One thing I wanted to make you think about is that if you have low blood pressure, you usually feel dizzy and pretty bad. But if you have high blood pressure, you might feel awesome. You might not feel anything. If your blood pressure ever gets too low, you can pass out and you can obviously die. High blood pressure, though, usually that's called the silent killer. That usually takes years of your life, where it injures your kidneys, your arteries, maybe gives you a stroke or a heart attack to kill you. Later in the course, we'll learn how the kidneys help regulate our blood pressure by affecting our urine output and our salt output. And we'll learn that later. All right, the next learning objective we're going to end with is to discuss local, neural, and hormonal regulation of blood flow. So what actually determines whether arterioles are vasoconstricted or vasodilated? It's pretty complex. It involves three sources: neural signals, local signals, and hormonal signals. So remember, blood flow to your tissues and your organs depends on blood pressure, your mean arterial pressure. So let's assume the heart's doing its job and that's normal. But now we can adjust the arterioles and the smooth muscle cells of our arterioles, either constricting them or relaxing them, and that will then change our blood flow. So again, if you make an arteriole smaller or decrease its diameter, you'll decrease blood flow downstream of that arteriole. Again, we call that vasoconstriction. If we open up our arterioles by relaxing the smooth muscle cells, which we call vasodilation, we'll increase the blood flow to the tissue downstream of that arteriole. And so in this way, we can sort of match our blood flow to whatever is needed. So remember, the diameter of our arterioles determines the blood flow downstream, which then determines nutrient delivery and how much blood flow goes to your organs. So local control depends on chemicals, and a lot of these chemicals are produced by our active skeletal muscle or active tissue cells. So let's look at some examples. So again, we're going to target the smooth muscle cells of our arterioles locally, and let's say you have an exercising cardiac myocyte. When they break down ATP, one of the byproducts is ADP. ADP can actually cause smooth muscle cells of the little arterioles locally to relax. So can CO2, as well as low oxygen levels. Other things like hydrogen ions as well. Nitric oxide is a gas made by exercising cardiac muscle and some tissue cells. So again, all of this causes those smooth muscle cells to relax, which causes vasodilation and increased blood flow. When you increase blood flow, you deliver more nutrients. All right, so in this way, lots and lots of local chemicals can specifically regulate those smooth muscle cells in those arterioles and then regulate local blood flow. Another important factor is going to be neural control of blood flow. So the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine. Norepinephrine typically causes smooth muscle cells to contract, causing that arteriole to vasoconstrict. This reduces blood flow then to that organ or that tissue. But what if your little skeletal muscle's exercising and it needs more blood flow? Well, luckily it can release all those local chemicals, ADP, nitric oxide, hydrogen ions, CO2, so the hydrogen might decrease the pH. Well, those local chemicals and those local signals would cause that same arterial smooth muscle cell to relax and cause vasodilation. So in this case, it's a balance between the local signals and the neural signals. Organs like the heart, the brain, and skeletal muscle, it turns out that the local signals dominate. The local signals are more important than the neural signals. In other organs, the neural signals are actually going to be more important. The neural signals will dominate. Examples of this include the arterioles that go to things like the skin. And so again, norepinephrine typically causes vasoconstriction. So if you activate your sympathetic nervous system to your kidneys or your skin arterioles, it can actually cause them to contract, the little smooth muscle cells. That would cause vasoconstriction and decrease blood flow to those organs. So in these organs, the neural control dominates and causes a very powerful vasoconstriction. Here we can see some of the chemicals that cause vasodilation, an increased diameter of our blood vessel, and also other chemicals that cause vasoconstriction or decreased diameter of our blood vessels. Again, it's so important because it ends up regulating the blood flow to our tissues. And if you're wondering why this regulation of blood flow seems so complex with the local chemicals and the neurochemicals, it's really so the body can specifically get blood flow only where it's needed, and specifically to the amount that it's needed. So blood flow is carefully matched to your tissue and organ demands. So for example, when you exercise, the arterioles serving your active tissues like your heart, and your brain and your skeletal muscles, they'll dilate so that you have increased blood flow. But then other organs like maybe your kidneys or your intestines or maybe your skin, if you're not very hot, those tissues will not need as much blood flow. And so by adjusting arterioles very specifically in each vascular bed in each organ, you can match the blood flow with the demands. And again, this helps us regulate blood pressure. All right, so arterial blood pressure is probably one of the best examples of homeostasis because it keeps your body happy and alive.